Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lynn Hessinga. I'm a principal here at SVA in our nonprofit industry group. I've been working with nonprofit organizations for over 15 years now in the Madison and the surrounding area, providing consulting, assurance, and tax services. Today's discussion is going to center around a board's role in planning, evaluating, and leading an organization. We all know that the role of the board is an important one. They should provide insight, oversight, and not just manage the day-to-day operations of an organization. Our key takeaways from the discussion today will include why leading with intent matters, how do you assess board performance, and what are the board roles and their responsibilities. Now, with our virtual format, we will take questions for our speaker using the chat feature, and we'll make sure to address those questions at the end of our discussion today. You'll also receive a survey via email later today. Please take the time to complete the survey, as we do use the information from that to improve our offerings and tailor our presentations to meet your needs. Our next event is not scheduled yet. However, please provide any thoughts you have on topics or speakers when you receive that survey, as your feedback there is really helpful for us. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Kirsten Houghton. Kirsten is a principal at SVA, our nonprofit industry group. She provides audit, accounting, and tax services specific to nonprofits. She holds a certificate of nonprofit board consulting from BoardSource and leads the SVA board building training program. Kirsten, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Hi, everybody. We were hoping today we could be in person, but unfortunately not. So we hope for the next event. My name is Kirsten Houghton. I'm a principal at SVA and one of the lead partners in our nonprofit services group. So with today's event, we're going to talk about your board and leading with intent. We'll talk about responsibilities of a board member. We'll talk about a lot of good ideas I think you can use to implement with your board, whether you're the board member that's attending today or you're from the nonprofit organization. So with that, to lead this off, we have how do you compare, because I'm going to go into a bit of a survey situation to go through with you. So we use the Leading with Intent report from BoardSource as our inspiration for this presentation. We thought the information was very important, so we want to make sure that we mention that some of the information, at least in the initial slides, does come from BoardSource, and then the remainder is a compilation of other sources as well, looking at what makes a board work these days and what's the most important things to focus on. So the survey results, and I promise that these two next slides are the only slides that are this detailed and this small. So don't be afraid that the entire content looks like this. But we didn't want to break this apart or change it in any way. I mean, this did come from BoardSource. We didn't want to tamper with anything. But I do want to show you that chief executives or executive directors were surveyed, as well as board chairs. And you can see by looking at this survey, there's different areas of board performance that were discussed. And chief executives are grading the board itself tiny bit lower than the board chairs are grading themselves. So you can see that there. Where the board ratings are pretty decent, but still work to be done, is understanding the mission, legal and ethical oversight, financial oversight, knowing the organization's programs, commitment to the organization. But you can see about halfway down the page, you get into, to me, what really is the role of the board when we can get ourselves out of operations. And I say we because I do serve on a couple of boards myself. And it's going into all those big picture items that really elevate the organization and help move it forward with the board's help and support. So it's strategic thinking, monitoring the impact of what the strategic plan and other decisions by the board do to the organization. What's that impact that happens when boards make certain decisions? Understanding the environment in which the organization works. Do people on, say, boards in Madison, Wisconsin understand the community and how it's a very philanthropic community, different than maybe from other cities? Understanding and evaluating the chief executive, their executive director's performance against goals. So that can be operational goals as well as strategic goals. And making sure that eval is done every single year. And so that executive director actually does get feedback that's helpful and that can help them do their job to the best of their abilities. Topic that always comes up and is still an issue that many are working on is building a diverse and inclusive board with a commitment to equity. So making sure we're not looking just at diversity in a tunnel, so to speak, or in a silo, as we're focusing on race or gender, but also looking at other diverse aspects of people that could serve on our boards. Monitoring legislation and regulatory issues. This is something that board members are responsible for, and typically that will fall to, say, the CPA or the attorney to keep the board informed. However, members should be aware of what they're functioning in. So for example, if you're receiving federal dollars, things like that, they should know that there are compliance requirements and things that have to happen with those dollars, and they can't just be used at will. So things like that. And then finally, leveraging board connections and networks to influence public policy decisions. Now all of you will run into this because you're not necessarily doing any lobbying work, but some of you do, and the board should be aware of what that work is, and if there are instances where they can be involved as well. Always, I will say, leaning towards not going into operations. Nope, I'm sorry. And then I'm sorry. This is not working here. Now we'll go back up. Here we go. All right. Little technical glitch on my part. The next slide, and again, this is my last of my tiny slides. It's the inverse of what I just went through. So the chief executive officers or the executive directors say there's not enough fundraiser, and there's not enough building relationships with the community. There's not enough focus on building a diverse and inclusive board. So everything that was like in the bottom of the first slide is now on the top of this slide. And you can see that there's not enough felt by many executive directors. Just right kind of evens out and climbs over 50% towards the bottom of the list. And then too much is kind of a non-factor here. So that you can see where there's just not enough work around all the things. And those were the grades with the C+, C-, that kind of thing. So you can see that inverse happening. So that's where people think things are today. And what I want to talk about is leading with intent and how boards can move the needle to make things better for themselves and for the organizations as well. Okay. So when we talk about a board that leads with intent, we're talking about boards that function as teams. Think of the best team that you ever worked with. That's your board can be that too, meaning it's a high functioning work group. People treat each other with respect. There isn't talking over people when people get a chance to share an idea. There isn't taking credit for other people's ideas. You share information. On the flip side of this is the management of the organization needs to provide the board with information they need for board meetings in advance, if that's where the information is coming from. Nothing worse than going to a board meeting where you just get all the materials 2 hours before that meeting starts. So good boards need that information to be prepared. You have to be able to have free and open conversations about what you're discussing. You may disagree. There may be things that are very serious facing the organization, and different board members have different opinions, which is great. But we all have to remember that we need to listen first and then, challenge and question, but come to consensus as well. So no bullying, no arguing, that kind of thing. And one big thing that happens, and we'll go through this at the end, is self-assessment. It's really important to assess as a board member individually and as a team what the board is doing. Where are the good things, where are the successes, and then also where have we fallen down, both individually and collectively. So if everyone will be very honest with themselves, did they attend enough board meetings? Were they prepared? Did they engage? Were they participating? That's where people need to be really honest with themselves and say, you know what, I think I'm doing pretty good, or no, I've got to up my game. And same as a board as a whole, to see how effective the board has been over the last year. So a lot to do with the board. Boards can get caught up in the day-to-day, the operations, the minutia, the organization. It kind of depends on what the organization does, in the sense that, do they rely on their board for operating help because it's a small organization and really the board is part of the team? Or is it a larger organization where the board really needs to stay out of the day-to-day and focus on all those strategic goals and the mission itself? So if we're leading with intent now, based on that survey, one thing that popped out of things that I was researching for this presentation is focus on fundraising above everything else can really kind of destroy the board and the organization. Because I say that because if you're only worried about fundraising, think of all the things that never get addressed. So sometimes organizations don't have a choice. They can think of the early days of COVID-19. Had there never been PPP funds and other funding that came through, and it was still a struggle, there was a huge focus on fundraising, but it can't be to the detriment of everything else. For other organizations that really rely on their board for fundraising, you're taking them away from doing other good work that they could do to move their organization forward, to allow fundraising to occur, by more people in the community. One thing here, and this goes to the last point as well, the lack of diversity. So boards being disconnected from the communities that they serve, where board members don't know anybody that the organization serves. They don't know the impact. They don't know, if you think of it like a health and human service organization, they don't know the challenges the families face that are being served by that nonprofit organization. Those are problems now that are occurring and still continue to occur. Certain boards, there's a low level of knowledge of the board of what the organization actually does. It's really important to get those program people into the board meetings on a regular schedule so you can talk about what's happening and share that good information so the board can become an advocate for you. And then again, another lack of diversity, if it's race, gender, life, and professional experience, that's an issue too. The board, I think I did this presentation years ago where we said the board members can typically look like each other. So in other words, you're on a board, you're asked to find some friends that might want to be on the board that could be a good candidate. And they are basically just like you. They have the same backgrounds. You may have known them for years. You kind of think alike. And it gets to where you've got a very homogeneous group. So it's always looking towards that diversity in all aspects, what other people can bring to the organization that will mix things up and change things and get different perspectives in there. So the goal of leading with intent then is, where do we want to go with this? The board knowing that what its function is, what its role is in this particular organization and how things get done. So if the board really is a hybrid of part operational, part strategic, just because of the nature of the organization, it needs to know where the boundaries are and how far it goes. And then how work gets done how much work is done with the executive director, for example. If the board is solely strategic and looking at big picture and is out in the community advocating for the organization, that would have different roles for people and how things get done. One of the main goals of board development and getting that leadership in place is recruiting and retaining. So I know many people are interested in how do we get those board members. That is one of the toughest things. And you want board members with perspective and expertise, but the difficult thing is many people that like to serve on boards and are good at it get asked lots of times. It's almost like there's a small pool of people that are on a number of boards. One thing here I'd say is to work towards building a pipeline of board members so that down the road, you already know who's planning to be the board chair 2 years from now, for example, or who will be the treasurer, or who will just be ad hoc board members on the organization. So working that pipeline is a combination of, maybe you have committees that have outside people that don't serve on the board. It's a great way for people to learn about the organization and encourage them to move up and then be a board member as well. That's where you're really looking at the community, and are there people in the community that you're serving that would make a great board member? Are there people that have an affiliated interest? They're a supporter, they're a big donor, and they do have time that they could give to the organization. So my key thing with keeping that board flowing so it's not a source of stress and just uncertainty is keeping a pipeline going and making sure you've got even years built out if you can, where people are committing to future terms, future service, and then keep them engaged. So those people that are saying, yes, I'd like to be on the board in 2 years, make sure you're checking in and that, yes, they will be on the board in 2 years. And then the culture of the board, we want to make sure the culture is good, like we talked about, like lots of nice open communication. We're talking, we're working together. How do we get things done and prioritize tasks and make decisions? And then obviously we want board leadership and impact. We want the board to actually move the organization forward in conjunction with the people working for the organization. One thing the board should always remember is to prioritize the organization's purpose and its mission, not get lost in things that don't really make sense for the organization. Don't get lost in things you're doing for other organizations potentially, and bringing that into the one you're serving at that point in time. What's interesting is respecting the ecosystem in which the organization functions. So meaning that, what's the situation? What does it function in as far as donors, the community at large? Is it answering to different governmental agencies? What does it function in? And how does that work within the context of the strategic goals and the day-to-day organization? Again, a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and what that means to the organization, as well as to who should be on the board that builds out those different perspectives and opinions, and also can relate to the people that the organization serves. One thing always to remember, though, a board is like anything else that we do. It's a work in progress. There is no perfection and there is no end. So in other words, it has power to change itself and improve. So if the board you're on or the board you have is a little stuck or is struggling, you can always get better. It's that attitude of like working towards something and making it better. And just always remember that we're not going for perfection. We're just going for improvement at all times. There, when the board leads it with intent, what happens? So you've got intention around things that are done. You mean to do what you say you're going to do. The effectiveness of the board and the chief executive officer or the executive director are interdependent. That always happens. We don't want to get into management as a board member, but we do want open communication with the executive director and other leadership so that we understand what's happening within the organization so that the goals of the board and the strategic goals can be implemented. Again, the board shapes and upholds a mission, can talk to people in the community, articulate a vision, and ensures connections, make sure the core values of the organization are communicated. Strategic thinking is involved. The board allocates time. I'm smiling because lots of times we'll put strategic discussions, whatnot, at the end of a board agenda, which we all know what happens. You get to the end and there's no more time left. So if that's the case, put it first. Have a separate meeting for strategic big picture thinking. Maybe that happens once a month and making goals around that. So we've got a separate time set aside specifically for that type of work and making sure that that happens, and not that it's always we just run out of time and it doesn't happen. So keep that in mind as well. Again, a culture of inquiry. You have mutual respect. You can debate each other. You can come to consensus. You can even argue, that's fine, but always with respect and listening and thinking first what's most important to the organization and its success. Independent mindedness. This is very key. It's part of even the Form 990 and the IRS compliance area. The board members have to put the interests of the organization first. So in other words, you'd never want a board member on your board that is interested in their own, what the IRS calls private inurement, meaning they can better themselves by their affiliation with your organization, whether that's better themselves in some intrinsic and tangible way or financially. And so always want to remember that and keep the board members independent. And then as always, transparency is extremely important. We all know that. Making sure that the board is communicating what is happening as much as you can. I mean, obviously you can't say everything, but then also offering information to the public. We know that the Form 990 is public, but also having honest conversations with people who may donate to you or are part of stakeholders or other funding agencies where they want more information about finances and operations and the results, and being able to point to that you're really moving that organization forward. Again, when you're leading with intent, you're promoting strong ethical values and you're giving oversight. And you link the organization's visions and plans to financial support and expertise and networks of influence. So meaning that you're tying together the vision, the mission, and the goals with how do we fundraise? Do we have the right people working for the organization? Do they have the expertise that's needed? Do we have connections in the community that can help us either financially or spreading the word or talking about how great we are, helping us find future employees or board members, and that the organization is results oriented. So in other words, we're on, say, September 15th, 2022. We have articulated our goals, both strategic and maybe some operational. We're going to break them down by half month, weeks, so that we get to the end of the year and we're like, wow, we made a huge impact because we did little things every single day, just like anything else you would do. Some of the things I wanted to mention too is leading with intent from a purpose-driven leadership perspective. So putting the purpose before the organization. So the organization's purpose is whatever it is, whether it's an arts organization, a human services organization, and making sure that purpose stays front and center, that people's eyes are always on the ball. We're not getting caught up in the day-to-day mini dramas that go on. What is the reason the organization even exists, and keep that front and center. So with that, and I've got about 4 or 5 slides, questions. A traditional board would ask what's best for the organization. If you're focusing on the purpose of the organization, you'll say what's best for the desired social outcome we seek. So in other words, saying it's not about the organization. What is your organization doing to make things better? They were formed for a reason. Are they doing the things that make things better in the community? Another thing to look at is respect for the ecosystem. So talked a little bit about ecosystem before. And knowing that the organization can positively or negatively impact its ecosystem. It has to be part of a more global, bigger effort, knowing what the impacts are of what it does on the community or its ecosystem it's working in. So again, traditional board asks, how would this impact our organization? A purpose-driven board says, really, what are the unintended consequences? How did this affect the ecosystem in which we work? So if that's, within the organization itself, the community it serves, the community at large. So what is happening with our decisions that have a greater effect outside of us? Another thing to consider with purpose-driven leadership with respect to in leading with intent is an equity mindset. So making sure that outcomes are equitable. So a traditional board would ask, how is our strategy to advance our mission? So again, very internally focused, all about us, not about what the organization is actually doing for people out in the community. And then a purpose-driven board says, how do our decisions affect equity outcomes? Is there ways to do things better? What are we doing that are actually making things worse? So it's taking, again, a bigger look at the big picture and what do the things that we do or we say or we believe in, what does that do to the rest of the community that we affect? And I think a lot of times we don't think that big picture, we don't get that big. And it's a good way to think of things of, what if I do this today? What does that affect the person down the road we're helping that we never intended to do, positive or negative? So that's always good to keep in mind. Another thing to consider with purpose-driven leadership is the authorized voice and power, meaning that communication must be authorized by those impacted by the organization work itself. So again, back to the community. So a traditional board would say, what do we think is best? And that the purpose-driven board says, we want to make sure that the community wants us to do the things we're doing because they're impacted. So in other words, they don't want us to do things that will negatively impact them. And are we listening to people telling us what is most important? So we may think as a board, this area is the most important. In reality, the people we're trying to serve is like, no, that's actually okay. We have needs over here. So really that goes into communication and listening, as with everything. So going back to that leading with intent, purpose-driven, I think it's a great way to look at the big picture. I think we don't go that big all the time, that there's a lot of opportunity out there. And again, it goes back to communication and talking to each other and making sure that we're actually listening and then adjusting what we do to serve the people we want to serve in the best way we possibly can. So with leading with intent, there are 3 main functions of a board of directors. And this whole presentation kind of repeats itself, but it's also interconnected, that it's important things that you can take away and use with your board, or if you're already on the board, use with the board that you're working with. But there are 3 main functions. The first, setting direction and strategy. So again, that big picture look, we're not just talking about operations. We're not trying to, fill positions within the organization, although that does happen. But we're looking big picture. So we're looking at strategic matters, and we have to define our priorities. And remember too, with a strategic plan, it's not just the board, it also affects the organization. So you can have strategic goals both for the board, for the organization, and there might be some combined goals as well. You have to also monitor the impact, as I had said earlier, of the goals and objectives. So in other words, we have these goals. What's that outcome? What's going to really happen if this comes to fruition and we achieve the goals? Financial resourcing, where's the money coming from? And then what are the risks involved, both positive and negative? And positive meaning like, if we do this, this big thing could happen. We do this, this could go very south. So looking at all those components and trying to make the right decision there. Next is providing oversight. So one of the main, with 3 functions of the board of directors, providing oversight to me is one of the probably the main thing to do. So making sure board members understand the mission, that they attend the board meetings, that they are prepared, which then again, that's up to the board chair. It could be up to the executive director, depending on what materials are needed, making sure that all goes out to board members in advance. We'll go into this later, but legal, ethical, and financial oversight. Many times people are recruited on boards, whether for-profit or nonprofit, and they're not necessarily that well versed in financial statements. And so they may not really understand what they're looking at. And so if you've got that situation, that's time to call in for some training so that you can understand what's happening. Also, looking at monitoring legislative and regulatory issues and evaluating the executive director, CEO's performance against strategic goals. So here's where the executive director needs that evaluation each year. And it's not just the operating goals that are involved, it's also the strategic goals. So to make sure you're providing that feedback to the people that need it. And then building a diverse and inclusive board with a commitment to equity. As I said, this keeps coming up over and over again, showing its importance to the board itself and really thinking about what diversity and inclusiveness means by organization. It's different for everybody. More oversight things to consider include approving the annual budget. So again, going back to the financial matters where you need to understand what's happening. Conflict of interest or other policies, making sure those are in place and followed. Conflict of interest comes into play very heavily in board work, making sure that there's no conflicts in certain business relationships and other things that can happen. The CEO, executive director job descriptions, making sure that those are in place and are followed. Board orientation is key too. Don't just have a board orientation to introduce everybody. Make sure that person, that new board member really understands what's involved and what the expectations are. They will learn over time about the organization. They will understand the strategic plan, but you really need to get their buy-in from day one, that they understand what they're doing, why they're there, how much time commitment there is, if there's a financial commitment, all of those details. Other oversight is succession planning. As our population changes, there's many people that are retiring. So you have planned succession, which in some respects could be easier because at least you know. And then there's the unplanned where people just decide that they want to do something different. And we have to plan for both. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. And then also oversight over disaster recovery. We always think of disasters as natural disasters, fire, flood, tornadoes, that kind of thing. But other disasters happen with cybersecurity and theft and fraud that can actually destroy your organization. So those things need to be in place as well. The last main function of leading with intent with respect to the board of directors is ensuring that there are resources for the organization. And resources, we always, at least maybe I do because I'm a CPA, I think of money, but it's also human resources and relational resources, meaning you've got relationships in the community, with your stakeholders, with the beneficiary of your program so that it's all working together. So for people, obviously, focus on the board members, the CEO, executive director, and the ability to resource staff members. So that's conversations where you're working really interdependently with the executive director. So the board understands the needs of the organization. They're not going to go on hiring, not doing the hiring, but they need to know what's happening. They need to know if there's serious holes in the staffing, if there's serious problems with funding, that type of thing. Going on to money, again, financial resources support the actual people. So in other words, we do want people to be paid fairly and that there's financial resources for that, as well as serving constituents and the program service work that's done. And then infrastructure that's needed too. And that can be, obviously building, but just the day-to-day, the things that are needed to run the organization. And then finally, ensuring resource with connection. You're engaging with the community, you're gaining trust and respect, and the community at large. So with that, I had mentioned we talk about succession. So this is kind of a hybrid of the board and the management roles. So looking at both of those things. So having a separate strategic document over succession planning is not a bad idea. Having that separated from the overall strategic plan of the organization. So we may know that in 5 years, the executive director will retire. We may know that we've got other positions that will open up because people have shared their plans. Somebody might be going back to school or is going to have a child and may want to take a step back. But we also have the unexpected, which happens all the time, especially now. And having a plan of how do we deal with the unexpected? What are the things we go to first? What are, say, the hiring search agencies we work with? You know, do we have job descriptions in place? Are we ready to go live with a job posting at any moment, and having those things in place? And then also looking at internally, are we the type of organization that has developed and trained people so they can be the successors to, say, an executive director or a CFO or the development director? Are we making sure our internal strength is there so that people can move forward in the careers and not leave the organization? At SVA, we do a lot of work on that ourselves, making sure that we are moving people into positions that they can succeed others that are retiring and leaving the company. So that's key too. Lots of times your best resources are within the organization itself and don't necessarily have to be found from outside. Other things to look, so with internal talent, identify people that are within the organization, and maybe they're not the ideal candidate today, but they could be in 5 years or in 2 years, and start working on that. Start training them, giving them more information about how the organization works, you know, anything you can share to be transparent, letting them know that they're part of a big picture, they're part of the future. We have been doing that so that people know that, you know, a bad day doesn't mean you walk out the door. You've got a bigger picture in mind, and there's a real future for them within the company. And then also promoting people in a way that matches with your plans. So you know you want a certain person to be ultimately the, say, development director in 2 years because that person's retiring. Start that promotion process, communication process, and then the training, all working together to get that person in the right position to succeed. And then if you do feel the need, no, we have to go outside. What's our executive search plan? Whether it's for a planned event, like a retirement of a key person, or it's sudden, and that you've got agencies lined up that can help you, that already understand what you'd be looking for. You've provided the job description. You've got interim staff available who are at a level, they may not have the interest, but they can do a lot of the duties, or it can be split amongst many people. So that's key as well. Then also looking at succession for board and management roles. There's onboarding. This is both for board and management. You need that person to understand their role within the board, also within the staff, and we all know that, but focusing on the board, make sure that person understands the amount of time commitment, what is needed. If there's major things happening, is there a major capital campaign coming up, things that may take more time than a normal board year. That way the individual knows what they're taking on versus, surprise, you thought you were spending 20 hours a year, and it's actually 50. So it's good that everyone knows what's happening right away. Integrate individuals into your organization and their team. This can be well said for the board as well. Making sure people are integrated, you have social time together, you get to know each other, and then also making sure they're part of the team and are treated that way from day one, so that their comments and questions are treated with respect. You'll always have people with learning curves that, you know, are understanding. It's that no question's a dumb question, although sometimes we feel like it's a dumb question, but making sure you're aware of that. And then with board members, assess the person's progress as they become part of the board. Give them, just like a person as well, a staff person, give them actionable guidelines for improvement, and then transition them from being new to being a full-fledged board member. These are all true for staff as well. So that's why it had put board and management roles. But really treating our board members as almost not employees, but keeping those same concepts in mind, I think are very important. So the board member has a successful transition on and is never feeling like they're like, I don't really want to go to this. I don't feel part of the group. They seem to have their own thing that they do, and I'm not really let in. Being really cognizant of that you're opening and welcoming and there to make them come in and be part of the team and get excited about coming to a board meeting, get excited about working for the organization. So a lot of information there, a lot of things to consider. I'm hoping that the things I'm saying and that we're providing to you will help you flesh out your board and refocus or focus on strategic big picture items, looking at the community, how the impact is, whether it affects, how decisions of the board impact the staff, the community, the people you're serving, and keeping those things in mind. Now we're talking about board roles and responsibilities. So these are some of the basics, and I'm sure many of you have heard this or know this, but it's always good for a refresher. There are actually legal responsibilities of board members, and I don't think everyone necessarily knows that when they join a board. There is a duty of care. So that's the expectation. There's a general level of competence that the person has. So they understand, they may not know every bit of minutia, but they understand a financial statement. They understand organization. They understand what nonprofit organizations do. This is that general competence. And that they take care that an ordinary prudent person would exercise in similar circumstances. So in other words, common sense. They would exercise good decision-making. They're not going to put the organization in jeopardy in any way or make decisions that would hurt the organization. Another duty that's a legal responsibility of a board member is the duty of loyalty. So a board member, and this is interesting because I do think a lot of people don't maybe consciously think of it or don't really realize this, but there is a standard of faithfulness, meaning that you've agreed to serve on the board and you must put the organization first. So in other words, you're loyal to the organization. You're there to make sure that it continues, that it does what it's supposed to do as far as serving its constituents. It doesn't fall out of compliance with different outside agencies or outside funders. So you think of audit compliance, the Form 990, compliance with grants and with funding sources. Also, you have to think of decision-making in the light that's best for the organization itself, and not for you as a person, not for the board, not for the public. What's the best decision for the organization to help move it forward and make good decisions on its own? And again, what I mentioned earlier, a concept called private inurement, where a board member cannot benefit personally from its affiliation with an organization. So you can't use it. So basically kind of an insider trading concept. You can't use information that you obtained from being on the board to then benefit yourself. So it's that same type of concept. And it can be identified, and the same kind of ramifications can happen to someone as well. And plus, not to mention the reputational damage that can occur as well to the organization. So it's a very important concept, the duty of loyalty, as is the duty of care, and board members need to be aware of that. Then there's the duty of obedience. There are 3 duties, and again, faithful to the organization's mission. So in other words, you're always thinking decision-making with an eye to what's the mission? What are we trying to do here? Where are we trying to go? Management of donated funds. So in other words, your donors are giving you dollars to support maybe just general operations, but maybe there's a certain program that they want all their money to go to, or there is a capital campaign, or they want to spread their dollars they're donating out amongst different things. As part of the board responsibilities, you need to be aware of that and making sure that management is managing the donated funds as intended by the donor. So that includes a lot of communication from, say, the CFO, the controller, whoever it may be, with the board, going through the financial results on a monthly basis or however often you meet. So if you meet quarterly, whatever it is, but that those financial statements are accurate first, because we have seen many situations as auditors where financial statements are not accurate and you're looking at inaccurate information all year. And then also making sure that those donated funds are managed properly. So that just goes into a lot of questioning and understanding concepts regarding net assets. So in other words, donations with and without restrictions. If you are working in this area, restricted donations are those where the donor will say, I want the money to go for this reason or over this period of time, or both. So we're talking about multi-year pledges and things like that. If it is for timing, it's going to come in over time. So you need to understand those concepts. You don't need to know every single bit of minutia that goes into that, but understanding that is key. Typically, though, those large donations that come in and say they're over time, everyone will be very well aware of them, especially board members too, because they may have had a hand in bringing that donation in, or just the impact on the organization itself. And then you have to obey the law, obviously, and the organization's internal rules and regulations. So the organization has its own way of functioning and behaving and carrying its objectives, mission, adhering to the strategic goals, et cetera. So these are things to consider. This doesn't typically get brought up in a board orientation. So making sure that the board members are aware that these tenets are out there and it is something that is actually required. Other responsibilities, I know we've talked about some of this already today, but just want to keep reiterating how important it is to select and evaluate and then support the executive director, the CEO, whatever your terminology is. being informed about the mission, the programs, and the policies of the organization, following the conflict of interest policy and any other policies that are in place, attending board meetings. Now, I will say that with COVID, a silver lining, not that there are many, but I had many people tell me that they had full attendance at board meetings since they went virtual. And if that's what it takes and people will come, I think that's very important. There's a lot of drive time involved and there's traffic issues and all that kind of stuff, but it's great that there's more and more people that are actually able to attend board meetings now that we all know we can work virtually. A board is always an advocate for the organization, so that ties into all these other things, knowing the mission, the services, the programs, and the policies. So making sure that all that knowledge base is there, that's part of orientation, ongoing training, ongoing discussions, so that I, as a board member, can go out to members of the community and talk about XYZ organization, how great they are, what they do, and how important that is. And that the decisions are made in line with strategic plans that are in place. Other responsibilities including approving the high-level goals, overseeing the executive director that we already mentioned, carrying out fiduciary responsibilities, meaning the money again, and understanding what you're looking at as far as financial statements and audit, the Form 990, serving on committees and task forces, and making a personal financial contribution to the organization. Now with this, not every organization requires this. Some do. It's a requirement of serving on the board. Some it's optional. Some people are trying to implement it, finding that difficult. So it all depends on the organization, but I think it's important for your board members to make some type of donation, to the organization. They're there too to help it. Another way to help it is financially, obviously, but to give that other level of commitment with a financial donation. Then finally, we'll talk about the search for board members and assessing board performance. So as I mentioned before, earlier in the presentation, we talked about how hard it can be to find board members. We all know it can be very difficult. It seems like kind of that well is tapped by the same people all the time. But one thing you want to do first before we even go searching for board members is look for desired qualities. And those qualities are commitment. They're very professional, they resolve conflict, they listen, they're creative, they're open and honest, they celebrate successes, they're available for social time. So social time, of the things that I've read and I've experienced personally, is huge. This can bind a board or group of people together, even though there may be a lot of conflict, if they just spend time in a social setting that's fun and they can talk to each other and get to know each other and see each other as human beings, as people, versus as board members. And so that's key as well. So keep that in mind of these qualities that you're looking for as you search for board members. When you define your desired mix of diversity, the skills you need, and the connections that you want your board members to have, it'll make it easier to really find those board members, to target in and do a targeted search. It limits the time spent on recruitment. This is all part of going back to that pipeline. So when you're figuring out, what do I want? Where am I going to get it? As far as where are these people going to come from? Do I know people like this already? You'll limit your time spent on recruitment. It'll become more of a normal standard operating procedure for the board to always know, where do we have some gaps coming up? Do we have people coming off the board? Do we need new people? And always assessing that, so we don't get in that crunch situation where, say, a board chair has already served 2 years and now they get to serve 2 more because there isn't anybody that will do it or that you can find. So it's always very important to keep that top of mind. Just some non-traditional suggestions for methods of the recruitment that you can consider. The leaders from the community that the organization serves, referrals from leaders. So asking people outside the organization, who would be great to be on our board? Who do you know? One thing that's not on here is, if you're working with an outside advisory board, in addition to your board, those are those leaders as well that could recommend people in. People who were part of your programs or maybe even ran the programs could be great board members. And leaders from other organizations that are similar to yours could be great board members as well. They would understand your issues probably pretty quickly and have less of a learning curve. Obviously, advertising board openings and using headhunters are options. I do think word of mouth and asking as many people as possible being able to articulate what you want and what the goals of the organization are will help people then think of others that could serve on the organization's board and help you out. The more clear you are about exactly what you need, the time commitment involved, if there's a financial commitment and the skills that you're looking for, the more likely you'll get exactly what you need versus people that may have great intentions, but just aren't a good fit for the organization. So things to keep in mind there. And then how do you find the right person? So board candidate questions. Not everybody interviews a potential board candidate. I think that's done much more now than in the past, definitely. But just asking the questions. Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to be on a board in general, especially if someone's never been on a board or even if they have? What's their experience? What skills do they have? Do they have a skill set that the organization needs that's missing? And do they have the time? I think to me, that's the biggest issue there. We all have very busy lives and lots of things to do and have very good intentions, but may not have the time. May have to say, you know what, I really want to be on your board, but I can't right now. I probably could be on it in 2 years because maybe I'm retiring or something like that. So that's things to ask and just have very honest conversations so that the person knows exactly what they're getting into as far as time commitment and all those other aspects that go into it. And then do they have the time? Because in the end, you could have the best candidate ever, but they can't show up for the meetings, they can't participate, it doesn't do you much good. So keep that in mind as you're interviewing people. Also even have them meet other board members so they get a feel for what the vibe, what the culture's like of the board, if they feel like it's a good fit, like they feel comfortable and they know they can participate and contribute. So keep those things in mind when you're looking for board members. Also with board members are board chairs. So board chair is a tough position, no doubt about it. You get to be many things at one time. You're working with the executive director, you're working with the board. You can be a moderator, you can be a argument solver, whatever that, I'm sure there's a better expression than that. But you wear a lot of hats as a board chair. Things to consider, good qualities are people are qualified. They've done it before, they're leaders. They understand the concept of working as a team, and that everybody has this, an opportunity to talk, that kind of thing. The other people on the board respect that person. So in other words, they will follow, they will listen, they will learn from that person. They have the ability, the desire, and most importantly, the time to serve. So again, we all know that a board chair can even be a more higher level of time commitment than other board members. So it's always good to keep in mind of, does that person have the time that you need to make sure that all these goals and all these things are happening, whether it's strategic, the financial issues, understanding what the organization does, all those things that wrap up into this. And then how can the board chair partner with the executive director and what kind of communication goes on? That's key, because if you have a board chair and executive director that don't really get along or don't see eye to eye, it can cause a lot of conflict within the organization and the board itself. And then finally, thinking of the board chair as the steward of the board culture. Clear that you have clear, I won't read every of these, but clear expectations of board service. Really, this is management of running the board meeting and getting people to come to consensus and move the organization forward. This here, I think, is an important slide to consider if you are serving as a board chair currently. I think it's very helpful just to keep these things in mind. If your board chair maybe isn't doing all these things and just needs a reminder, or maybe hasn't even been thinking along these lines, this could be helpful as well. And then as you're developing your board, keeping all this in mind. And this is what a board chair does. You know, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of moving parts and balls to keep in the air. So making sure you've got the right person. Then finally, looking at the impact of regular board self-assessment. I won't go through all these because we talked, not we, but I've talked through all this whole presentation, but there is a lot to consider. And it's really important for the board to assess itself as a group and then also individually. So in other words, maybe some of these items are NA on a personal individual basis, because say as a board member, I don't necessarily provide guidance to the chief executive, but I need to think strategically. I need to be committed. I need to understand how the organization works. So it's really important. I think people will be very honest with themselves when they say, hey, you know, I didn't attend enough meetings and I wasn't necessarily prepared every time and I could do a much better job, or, hey, I think I'm doing a great job and I think this board is too, and where could we elevate from there? So this is something that can be done annually. I think that's really important. Something that in my experience doesn't happen a lot. And so it's another tool that you can use. And there's a second page here as well. more of the keeping in mind, monitoring, evaluating, building relationships, knowing what's going on. So you can find board assessment tools all over the place. You can tailor things to your organization that makes sense, adding in things that are specific. So if you are in the middle of a capital campaign, or you just put together a strategic plan, things that might directly relate to that and how that's being implemented. So I think this is an important tool and something to consider. You can have general things where people really start to get into thinking of like, have I done my best here? What can I do to make this even better experience for myself and then for the board as a whole? So with that, I've been talking for 50 minutes and we're to the question part. I know we have some questions and Lynn's going to jump in and ask me those questions. And we may have covered parts of some, but we'll see what more we can offer.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kirsten. That was some
Sure.
great useful information there. So, so one of the questions that did come through is, do you have any hints or tips on getting board members to financially support your political action committee or even the charitable foundation arm?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we all know that's a tough one. You can with board agreement, I mean, as a vote to get a mandatory contribution of some base minimum up to whatever they'd like to give. And that's an option to go, which a lot of boards have done. People are reluctant to set a dollar amount, but that can be done as well. And some discussion obviously would have to go into that at the board level of, are we all comfortable with that and do we agree? Some people may feel it's not fair because that's, when they joined the board, they didn't know. You could also have board members that can't afford it. So you've got to consider that too. So it's just keeping all those things in mind, but having that nice open conversation to say why it's important. Why is it important that the board financially supports the organization? And keep that in mind as well.
All right, another question that came through is how do you progress diversity, equity, inclusion practices, especially when the board members are outside your organization and they may not have a common or a shared understanding of the topic?
Yeah, I mean, that's really tough one. Diversity, equity, and inclusion comes up all the time for a reason, because it is a hard area, especially when you do have, say, a homogenous board or board members have been on a very long time. They're used to things being done a certain way. I think the biggest thing is communication. I think that terminology can be confusing. What does diversity mean? Or what does it mean specifically to the organization? What does equity mean? Are we talking about treatment, allocation of resources? What does that mean? And then inclusion. And I think sitting down to define those terms of what that means for the organization and then translating it into, this means we need this kind of person, or we need this kind of experience. I think that will get you to more open discussions. I think we get lost in the terminology and it seems unknown and I don't understand what that means. And just breaking it down to what does that mean to this specific organization? And then also showing the benefit of having different, say, diversity in opinion or diversity in experience will bring to the organization that you don't have. So again, it's having those honest conversations, but I think really breaking down what those words mean to a specific organization will help then the board members understand what it means and why it's important, and then act from there.
All right, great. Another question that came through was, this individual has been with an association for over 30 years. And the board doesn't really take any interest in the items that are discussed or proposed. They trust the decisions. However, the individual would want more input from them. So how do you make the board more responsive in those cases when they kind of feel stuck and they don't want to respond?
Yeah, that's really tough because they're used to whoever submitted that. Thank you. They're used to you and they trust you, but that's to me being a bit lazy. They need to be in a position to challenge what you're saying and see if they agree or not. I mean, they're there for reasons that we just went through. To get them more engaged, I think one of the big things, if you haven't done it already, is just ask them, like, I need more from you. One thing to bring up, if you've been doing this for 30 years, I would think that sooner rather than later, you're probably considering retirement. So that's going to bring in a great deal of transition and change. And this would be a great way to broach that with the board saying, I know you guys believe in me and you just basically agree with what I say, and or however you want to phrase it in a nice, polite, tactful way, not what I'm doing. And then say, but this day is coming and you're going to be dealing with a new person who isn't going to know all the things I know. So I'd like to start talking about getting you more engaged and more involved in this. So when the new person comes in, you're on board and we're all ready to go so we can keep running smoothly. I think that's kind of a nice natural way to do it if that's what's happening. I'm just saying that giving the years that you mentioned you were involved. So that would be something to consider and broach it that way, because it's like, we need to do this because this is an event is happening. And, or just simply, if you're going to stay for a while, just simply be very honest with them. Like, I need your feedback. I need your help. I need you to be more engaged. I need to know that I need more. I just need more. And you do. It shouldn't be just up to you. That's a lot of load and pressure and responsibility to carry all by yourself.
All right, and the last question that came through was around strategic planning. So what are the ideal roles between the board, the staff during that process of planning? Who leads, who's following that discussion? It's probably a mix of both, but just your thoughts around that.
Yeah. So one is, with strategic planning, a lot of it's done with a consultant, which can be very helpful because it takes the board members, the management, and the staff kind of more evens out everybody. It's not coming from the board. It's not coming from management. It's coming from this third party who's well-versed in strategic planning. I've been through that process and it works well. That way you've got that impartial third party, which is great for discussion. That way you can really focus on what needs to be done and where those then roles and goals lie. Is that a board goal? Is that a staff goal? Is that a management goal? Are there hybrid goals that affect more than one kind of group if we're going to group people into 3 groups? So I think that's really key. Trying to do it on your own can be difficult. You can get into a lot of agendas and a lot of, people trying to kind of get what they want, and it's not really focused on the organization. So I think that's key if that's an affordable option for people. Other than that, if you have, an internal person or a leader on the board that is able to be impartial and can run that process for you, and I think that's what the question is asking, that could be a workable solution as well. As far as the roles of when the goals are implemented, they could be, as I said, I'd like to call them hybrid goals, where they could be part board, part management, and then there's role sharing as far as who's in charge. I think it's a pretty fluid experience. Did I answer that question right, Lynn?
Yeah. And I think there was a follow-up.
I hope I did.
Here in the chat feature of kind of with that is, what is an ideal number of members to have on that kind of strategic planning committee? Is there an ideal number? Maybe there's not, but just kind of your thoughts there.
Yeah. I mean, as we all know, a big group gets difficult, lots of voices,
right?
The herding cats concept comes into play. I think it's always good, like 8 to 10, I think is a good number. I know I've seen that before. You don't get too many, but yet you have a lot of voices. And then making sure about who's in that room, the representative of the staff, management, and the board. So it's not, the board members did the strategic plan and now we have to carry it out, but we had no input. That will disengage the staff instantly and they could care less about what happens there. So it's getting input from all those resources who then can go back to their, say, constituents, communicate what's happening and get more feedback from the people that, they're the representative. So say there's 3 staff and those 3 staff, the representative of the staff of 50, that kind of thing. And then that way they've got someone to go back to and the people that aren't in that committee can feed up questions as well.
And there was just one final question that came through, Kirsten. I'm going to ask you. We have a little bit of time here, 2 minutes left. So any suggestions on how to and when to fire or retire a board member?
I see that one. That's why we have term limits. But no, that's true. And lots of organizations do have that board where people have been on forever. And that can be very tough. There's no one right way. I would say it goes back to having honest conversation of maybe approaching it as, what are your plans? What are you thinking? We, always with a thank you for the service of the number of years somebody has been on your board, for that person that should retire, who's been great, but they need to move along and somebody else should be on. And thinking about, I'm thinking about succession planning. I'm thinking about where the board goes. What are your plans? And broaching it that way versus like, I think you should retire. Giving that person the option to say, I've really been thinking, and you can get a conversation going that way. The person to fire, I don't think any of this two should fall on one person to have that retirement or firing conversation of a board member. I think the board chair should be involved and have a private conversation with 1 or 2 others. And that person who is disruptive or whatever the problem is that really needs to be let go off the board, and just, again, approaching it like, what do you think of your board service? Going that kind of like you do with your children, where you ask your questions like, why did you do this? And taking that route. So it's not accusatory. People don't become defensive. You can get to a conversation, and the person who maybe needs to be fired maybe wants a way out and doesn't know how to do it. So there's always that there. Sometimes people just need that doorway to be open, and they say, or the person that needs to retire and say, yeah, I'm kind of ready to leave. I'm glad you asked. So again, it's all about communication and conversations, but in those situations that can be very explosive, I would never send somebody to do that on their own. It'd be good if there were a couple board members involved in those conversations, confidentially, of course.
Great. I think that was all of our questions that we had come in.
All right.
Okay, pass it back over to you to close out. 1 o'clock.
Okay. Yeah, no, we did good. Well, thank you, Lynn. And thank you to everyone that attended. We really appreciate it. And for those of you who will hear this that couldn't attend today in person, I thank you as well. We do have a board building series where we have modules built out into 6 sections that can be combined, can be done as a group, can be done one at a time, can just do one, where we could provide training to your organization. So that's a resource and an option that we have. I really enjoy doing this type of training. So if you're interested in talking to me further what we could do for your organization, please reach out. I would love to work with you. And then also, as Lynn said, we don't have our next event schedule, but if you've got topic ideas and speaker ideas, please put it in your surveys, because we do use that to find new speakers and topics. Want to make sure this is valuable to you and we're not using your time in ways that obviously isn't valuable. We want to bring like the hot topics of the nonprofit sector forward and have people talk about those things that can help you out. So keep that in mind as well. And we are at our time. So I will just say thank you and hope you have a good afternoon. Thanks a lot, everybody.